Okay, I'm now recording our last
Maybe,
class on chapter 12.
thank you, Maxine. Maybe we can do a round of impressions and then go deep in. Ken, you're already are inspired to do so, so maybe you can go first.
Well, like I already said, I was really excited about this chapter and epilogue, and I found it very inspiring that Bookchin's vision for humanity as being a part of nature, not separate from nature, and that we can use our understanding of the things that have worked in the past and apply them to the present and be part of nature in our way that we construct our social ecology and our lives. I also loved the understanding of gardening and local systems and all the things that the permaculture movement has. But what I said before we were recording is that I like that he had one of my favorite scientists devoted quite a bit to Lynn Margolis's discoveries of symbiogenesis. So that's all I need to say right now.
Thank you.
Glad to hear that.
I could go. So I really, really loved it. I thought it was a really beautiful culmination of his arguments across the entire book, and I think he did a really good job of concisely summarizing all of the different points he made and synthesizing them in a way that was really interesting, and just appreciated the way that those synthesis of different principles and the different trajectories of nature of domination and hierarchy come out in this like fleshing out of like a vision of an alternative, and then the acknowledgement that we can't be clear on the forms that would take because it has to arise naturally out of the ethics and the values of the people who make it up. And so I thought that was really interesting. It left me hungry for case studies. I've been finding this a lot lately where, the theoretical is really interesting. I love talking about principles and how those principles flesh out into visions. And then I really want to know like how concretely there are communities fleshing out these visions and what their decision-making processes are like and what their structures are like and what their administration is like. And and just their rhythms and rituals. And so I'm excited to hopefully delve deep into more concrete examples of how these theories are instantiated in different communities around the world. And I know Maxine has a lot more insight into that. But yeah, there was a bunch of really interesting points that came out of. I loved the maybe he had made this distinction before, but it hadn't clicked. But he talked about hierarchy being a psychological form and domination being its social form. And I thought that comparison was really interesting, or way of delineating them. And then there were some critiques that I had that maybe we can dig deep into later, but I also really, really appreciated the part on 437 where he goes into how councils are fundamentally hierarchical, which really threw me through a loop because a lot of the social structures that I work on in different collectives have councils, and so it's interesting to see that.
Agree with that?
What was that?
Say you agreed with him or you didn't?
Not that I agree or disagree, but I had never been confronted with that critique so intensely, and so I just want to dig deeper in it. I'm not sure how I feel about it. It definitely puts a lot of my own work into question. And then as much as I didn't jive with the super in-depth scientific analysis, I did really appreciate his emphasis on self-organization in nature and life forms and how that relates to self-organization and self-governance in human systems and social systems. So I was stoked on it. So I'll pass it on.
Could I say something just about that self-organization thing?
Sure. Yeah.
that's the exciting thing about Prigogine's work, and that is that in something that he calls, well, in a self-organizing system, the more energy that passes through the system, the more likely it is to spontaneously organize in a more complex and more varied form. And that principle is a principle that's just like Bookchin's central point. It makes it that any life system, any ecological system is a system like that. So if the energy comes to it, it gets more and more varied and complex. And then that contradicts the law of thermodynamics that's called entropy, where things get more and more chaotic and more disordered. So the question for me becomes, is our universe essentially a complex system where it's getting more complex and more varied? In other words, a living system, or is it a dead system getting more and more entropic? And I think that the thing that I believe is that it's essentially the former. It's essentially a system that's getting more and more complex and varied and interesting. And so now we only have one law of thermodynamics, because when Einstein made that law that energy equals, the law that we all E equals mc squared, that we could convert matter to energy, the three laws, the conservation of matter and conservation of energy, became the law of conservation of matter and energy. And now with this, what Prigogine calls dissipative structures, but we're calling complex systems, then we only have one law of thermodynamics if entropy is just a subset in those rare instances where there's not much life happening.
Fascinating. And what's the name? Is Ilya what?
Prigogine, Prigogine. I'm not a good speller, I'm sorry.
Okay. Huh.
And it's research done about 40 years ago. And to me, it should, like Lynn Margolis, it should be celebrated because it's so important, but it's kind of the main way that a lot of people are thinking about it, including scientists, is so rigid that it didn't make the impact that it needed to, and that's how I think about
it. Interesting.
But anyway.
Sounds juicy.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah. No, thank you for that. But I want to hear from others in terms of their impressions.
Mario? Lenore?
No. As I told Maxime, I've not been able to read much of this week because of all the other classes and stuff that I've taken on. So I'm predominantly a listener and enjoying you all weekend. You'll excuse me for not being so participatory.
Oh, you're fine. I do encourage you to read it afterwards, though, because it's probably the most accessible chapter of the whole book, I'd say.
Some of it, and it was, but I just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Mario, would you like to share, or shall I?
Yeah, no, I will share my point of view. First, I'm going to disagree a little with Ken. My vision of the universe, and according to thermodynamics, I think any spontaneous process in nature calls for an increase. That's according to the laws of thermodynamics. If you believe in them, you can say, well, I don't believe in them. That's perfectly fine. But if you believe in them, it implies an increase in entropy. And you can create order, but you need, as Ken says, energy. And this is a closed system. Our bodies are a closed system. We are creating order through our biology, but we need a lot of food, a lot of energy to do that. But it's a closed system. In general, if you look at the universe in general, there is always an increase in entropy. And that increase in entropy means that the universe is going to be more chaotic, and the story will end bad. Again, if you believe in the laws of thermodynamics. Okay, so that's my point about that. Other than that, I love Marx and Prigogine. I think they're genius, and you are absolutely right that they should be acknowledged more and given more. Anyway, so my take on this chapter, as you said, is different. It only gets into this citation of Marx and all the philosophers, the Greeks at some parts. It's long. One of the things I wondered, I like the Chinese, and I wonder if they read him, because they are saying that what they are building is an ecological society, and they make constant reference to an ecological society and not society, civilization. They use exactly the same words. Ecological civilization. We are building an ecological civilization. Of course, they have many environmental issues, but this is their goal, to build an ecological civilization. Anyway, so for me, I found very interesting the parts where he says that we need to re-enter natural evolution again. Barbarous objectification. Well, the ecological society. Sorry, I'm not. Well, I think the essence for me is that a community guided by usufruct, complementarity, and the irreducible minimum must be extended from the king group to humanity as a whole. That's for me the essence. He talks a lot about contracts, and in that contracts are basically creating. They were not necessary in the organic societies or ancient societies, and how contracts create this antagonistic functioning of our society. So contracts is an important part. I love the part when he talks about the Marquis de Sade.
Yeah.
That was surprising.
Yes. In my view, this culture of domination, this civilization of domination that he talks about, it's interesting because I related to an interview that I heard on the radio a couple of days ago, where they were in this program in NPR Forum. They were interviewing a journalist and a writer, and he was saying that he was going he's studying, he believes that Trump is going or has good chances of being reelected in 2020, and he's going to the Trump events to talk to the people, interview the people that go there. And this is the domination, the way we are dominated, I mean in general, for the population, by this idea that we have the freedom, because, this idea of freedom that we are so proud of, this freedom. He says, when I interview a couple of persons that were they were selling posters, make America great again and things like that. And I asked them, do you have health care? They said, no, we don't. Wouldn't it be nice if we could tax a little more the rich and you will have access to health care? And they said, of course not. How can we do that? We're going to be rich at some point. So this, people have this freedom. We all think that we're going to be rich at some point. And we have this is the culture of domination, that people accept happily not having access to education, not having access to healthcare, being more and more stupid as each generation passes, just because they may have the opportunity to be rich at some point. Anyway, so this is my take, and that's all from my side. I didn't go to the epilogue, but now that I heard Ken's comment, I will go.
Yeah, same here. I'm looking forward to reading it now. Yeah, so I was definitely interested in, I found this chapter very inspiring, and it brought up some questions that I thought I would share. Gosh, where to begin? Well, I was curious, and Ken, you also bringing up Lynn Margulies and Elia Prigoggi. I was curious how quantum physics fits into any of this too, because he talks about energy and he talks about consciousness in this chapter, particularly in terms of how do we create an ecological society in which all citizens are participating in policy formation, when most of us feel like the great majority of people are not very competent, right? So we have this sort of internalized hierarchical sensibility about who's competent or who isn't competent. Never mind whether we're electing people who are wealthy who may be incompetent. Like he's not even talking about that, because obviously he was, Trump was not president at the time this was written, but he talks about the fact that of this universal humanitas, and that at some point in the spectrum and some point of their story, we have to have an agreement in a way, or set our sensibility to the possibility that everyone can be competent to engage. If we think they can't, we're not going to make room for their participation and our own, right? Because how many of us think, I mean, I would think, oh no, I can't do what they're doing in Congress. I can't read all that stuff. I can't do all that. So I eliminate myself from the sphere of governance because I can't work in that system. So what if we're talking about what kind of system would enable all of us to participate at some level? And I really enjoyed that he went into some of the basic understandings or key components to an ecological society that's libertarian, and that he actually defined a libertarian institution, what that looks like.
Versus authoritarian, which I thought was a really primary distinction. Yeah. Right,
because so many of our examples of communities and movements have maybe intended to be libertarian, but they ended up being somewhat both, right?
If I can bookmark something for later, is that it might be good to differentiate between the way he uses the term libertarian and the way that we use it in contemporary discourse.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And if anybody would like to, if you want to weave on that, that's fine. I really didn't have an understanding of libertarianism to compare to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would love to just hear more of your impressions and questions, and then maybe that's one thing we could dig deeper into.
Okay. All right, well, I'm gonna bring up a couple of highlights for me. So one was that I was curious, okay, what are his suggestions on how to achieve a better society, right? Like we're talking about. Number one, he wants discussion in the public sphere. So I thought that was, like he said, dialogue as a public event. So that was kind of took me forward. And he said also that without the contrast between history, which I would say we're losing in the public sphere, without contrast between history with the present, and then the possibility of a future that could be better, there's no tension that would motivate change or resistance to an existing system. So this is like a major problem that we've got in our current situation, as I see it, is that we're losing our sense of history. We're losing that tension. People are just kind of in the persistent now and losing their, nobody wants drama, nobody wants tension. We're all tension averse, but you have to have tension to create and to participate in something moving forward in any kind of better way. Otherwise we lose it.
In fact, there's propagandists directly working at erasing history and presenting fantasy as history,
Right.
which is just makes it even harder.
Yeah. So Bookchin says daily life must be viewed as a calling in which we have an ethical responsibility to function in a state of unrelieved opposition to its prevailing norms.
Wow.
What page is that?
That is page 434. And so leading off of there, our choices will keep alive the contrast and the tension that technocratic and bureaucratic homogeneity threaten to efface, together with personality itself. So these were really very primary concepts that resonate with me in terms of what I've been experiencing. And it's like a force field just to have a discussion in a group. What we're doing here is rather radical. I've been trying to gather with a small group of people, discuss these things for 4 years. What's going on that people don't want it? What?
Thank you for persisting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess I feel a lot, I feel kind of like allied with Bookchin, you know, like I feel this is a calling for me personally. And then let's see. Oh, and then he says public space, like inner space, becomes mere empty space when it is not structured, articulated, and given body. So that connects to what you were saying, Mario, about the organizing principle and what it takes to give form, to take energy and create form with it, which nature's doing all the time and which we have the opportunity to do, utilizing our consciousness. And so this is where, for me also, it's particularly exciting because Bookchin is talking about the interpersonal, the psychic work, the work we do in our own psyches, and how that must be wedded with what we do in the public sphere. And at the same token, I've seen many people who are lifetime activists who don't do the inner work. And the hierarchy is there. And the disconnect, the relationship problems are there. So it has to happen both and. We see the failure when we leave off the personal work or we leave off our work in the public or social sphere.
Well, I agree with you, but I've seen that same problem with activists for, decades, where activists I was working with 3.5 decades ago, didn't want to do any personal work, didn't even want to read an article about doing personal work in activist groups. And I just have to say, because it's synchronistic with this moment, the main activist in that group, that particular group, became a rabid Trump supporter in the last election.
It's,
after having been a community activist.
we have to do.
Lenore, you're chuckling. What?
No, I mean, it's terrible, you know, but it's, yeah, it's funny that I assume this was an activist group, that it was a progressive group.
It was a very progressive group. It was about anti-nuclear things and preference voting and all kinds of Citizens for Public Accountability group.
But you see, what that draws to mind is that when a person doesn't do their inner work and look at what's motivating them, then they're subject to all kinds of influence.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to bring up a conversation you and I had after class a couple of weeks ago, where I was sharing that I had heard some interesting critiques of one of my favorite examples of a solidarity economy in Jackson, Mississippi, and they're really being brought down by the egoism of some of the leaders and the competitive nature of these different groups. And so it really reminded me of how shallow the structures that we create are. And we could create as many equitable power decisions in the structures, but if they're not led by people who have done that inner work and have looked at the hierarchies within themselves and the preservation of their own identity over community, then those structures won't succeed in being actually equitable.
Precisely. And Bookchin is talking about that there is no ecological society without culture. So we're talking about not just governance, we're talking about culture, creating a culture that is conducive, that is fertile ground for behaving in ways that are more naturally non-hierarchical. Because currently our dominant paradigm, our what's going on in the world is so intrinsically run on hierarchy. We don't even see it. It's invisible to us. So one other thing that came up for me that I just want to be sure and mention just through my part, because this was really an important theme that kept coming up when he was talking about competence and how do we create a population of active participating citizens with competence to make decisions that are good for everyone. And I kept thinking about this term that I learned through Waldorf education, which is servant leadership. And that is like an archetype that Rudolf Steiner spoke about. And it came up over and over again, and I finally looked it up, and I want to share the definition of servant leadership. And this is specifically in regard to on page 439, when Bookchin is talking about direct action, reclaiming public sphere, with culmination as an active participant, and authentic expression is the painstaking work of citizenship. So, okay, so servant leadership. Leadership philosophy built on the belief that the most effective leaders strive to serve others rather than accrue power or take control, and that it's a conscious choice that brings the aspiration to lead. And so I found myself wondering, I wonder how to create an aspiration to lead from that kind of place in the culture. like, how would we go about that in so many ways? Because I think that that's really important. And then my final thought is how he was talking about the affinity groups, essentially, that in what are the decision-making bodies that he perceives would be most efficient, effective, and supportive of an ecological society. And it was groups based on natural affinities, whether it's artistic. Like, I was thinking about it, an example of this would be an artisans guild, the old guilds. So all the bakers, right? All the actors, all the, like that. But it could also be cultural affinity. It could be emotional compatibility. Like, there's so many different kinds, and they don't need to be limited.
Yeah, there's it's 443 where he goes into like what kind of associations could we expect to find in our future ecological society, and like goes into listing them of just like the limits of understanding things by blood ties, and just showing all the different ways that we could associate ourselves by cultural preferences, intellectual preferences, emotional capabilities. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I believe this is what's been taken up in Rojava, that all the decisions are made by these like affinity groups throughout the region, the different regions, and they send their representatives to like a Congress, but the Congress doesn't make the policy. They just do the logistics, and all the policies made by the people in their affinity groups. So it gives that ability for people who are social by nature to align with other people that they feel comfortable with and that they share values with, right? And make their policy here and here and here and here, and then find what is the common threads for everyone. So
Maxime, in your understanding of the Rojava affinity groups, would they be similar to stakeholder groups, or is it more like we share these same values, so we're in an affinity group and we make policies together, or is it like we have a similar stake in this decision that's being made?
My understanding, and this was from reading from a few years ago, and I have no idea how the wars have changed, if they have changed what they were doing, but my understanding was it was more like artisan guilds, like the ones who are involved in, I'm going to use an old example because I don't know if what their economy is anymore, but like the shepherds, in this region, the weavers in this region. So it's all regional. So like Bookchin talks about, that we want to be rooted in our ecosystem. So we're paying attention to what does the land need, which is a permaculture thing, right? So we have examples in our living world now about how to do these different things, which I found also interesting. And it's almost like, wow, permaculturists could help us learn how to root, not just situate a community. Like if we're going to build a housing development, how would that change what we do if we're not just, we're going to pick that plot of land and we're going to concrete and then we're going to, but instead look at the land like, according to permaculture, for anybody who doesn't know, what you would do is you'd go to the place that you're thinking about and you'd watch it for a year, through the seasons, through the hours of the day, what's happening, what animal life comes and moves around, where does the water flow, right? And all of these things. And then only after a year of studying and being in it and really feeling it, then you can interact with it to help improve. That's what he's talking about, taking our human quality and bringing our best to the best that nature has. So I'm going to give you an example of that. May I?
Sure.
I don't want to dominate the conversation either, but just a little quick example that I went to an event in December, and I was taken on a tour to look at the water in the land. And this was mind-blowing to me. So we went out into the forest, and these are second growth trees, I was told. Well, it looks like forest, but they're young trees. And then we're looking at what's high, what's low. It's not like flat, there's all kinds of terrain. And then we were asked questions like, where do you think the water goes here? And what do you think happens there? And in some ways I didn't know. Sometimes I went, I think it goes like this. But they showed us a bunch of things, and they said, well, this land wasn't holding water anymore, because once those old trees were cut down, nothing operates the same. So instead of when it rains, the rain absorbs into the soil, feeding all the plants, and then going down into the water table, and then being available later for all kinds of uses, and percolating slowly and filling up that river, that creek that's down there. It was just flooding down the hillside and flooding the roads and being lost. And then things weren't growing up here. It was dry in the middle of the Cascadia forest. So what they did after watching was they made an area, natural area, where the water would pool, and they deepened it, and they created a pool there. And what it did was it captured the water, and the weight of the water created hydrostatic pressure, so the water slowly seeped in. And now the whole area holds water, and it doesn't flood off and disappear, which is a huge problem that we have in cities because of the way things have been done and paying no attention. So that's just an example that most of us don't have any idea how to read landscape. But there are affinity groups of permaculturists, as well as indigenous people who live in their land that they've been living in for millennia, who know it really inside and out, that we can tap into for information to help us. So. Long-winded answer.
Thank you for sharing
Good
that.
answer. It's concrete.
Yeah. So we have about 40 minutes left. There's a few things that I wanted to cover, can maybe prioritize them. One of them is to just, like I said before, talk about the difference between the way that Bookchin is using libertarianism versus the way that we use it, because I'd feel bad if we all left this book and used that term in public and then came into disagreements with others, because he uses it in a very, very different way.
Right.
And then the other two things I was thinking was to dig deep. So he outlines 3 principles of social ecology on 436, 437, and 438. And we talked about the second one a little bit in terms of direct democracy. And I wanted to just kind of dig deeper into, like, what would that really look like to have participation on decisions that affect a lot of people. And so that's a discussion we can go into. And then the last one is that I have a critique of his third principle. Not a critique, but the third principle is that he emphasizes direct democracy is ultimately the most advanced form of direct action, which is true. But then the examples he gives are all protests. Mm-hmm. The direct action is protests, which is reactive and not very proactive, and also creates. He gives this sense of self, this exercise of the self as through protest, which is really identity in the negative and not in the positive. It's like I identify myself by what I'm against and not what I'm for or the ways that I want to be. And so those are 3 different lines of thought I can go down, but I wanted to touch on them. Does anyone have a preference of Which one?
That feels great to me to go over those pieces and
Okay.
start with the
I like you providing structure. That's wonderful. Can I read a definition, his definition of libertarian?
That would be great. Yeah, and if you can
453, and then you can go with that. It's in the middle of 453. He says, in short, to conflict with this, my definition of the term.
Oh, I'm sorry. What, Lenore?
I was just going to say what part of that page, because I'd like to
It's
find
right in the middle.
Oh,
It's
yes.
in
my
it's
definition.
the end of it starts my definition of
see.
um,
Go ahead.
my definition of the term libertarian is guided by my description of the ecosystem, the image of diversity, spontaneity, and complementary relationships free of all hierarchy and domination. By authoritarian, I refer to hierarchy and domination. So that was just a simple definition that he gave of libertarian that identifies it with ecosystem, diversity, spontaneity. It's not what we politically think of it as at all.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Sophia, I have a question. If you could also, you mentioned something about, I think we spoke briefly about the universal income, and you said you were against that, or you were critical of that. So if you could also talk about that, I would appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely, for at least a little bit, yeah. So the first thing with libertarianism, so the way that it's defined here, in terms of spontaneity and unity and diversity and complementary relationships, it's interesting. I think the way that he uses social ecology in other places, I think, is a really, really fitting thing to distinguish it from both libertarianism and contemporary use and anarchism. I think he's avoidant of the word anarchism just because of he's critical of Proudhon in a few places. And so the commonality between the way that he uses libertarianism and the way that we uses it is this sense of autonomy and being able to have, liberty is the common core, is that people have a sense of liberty in the sense of that their basic freedoms are recognized and they're able to be autonomous. But the way that he uses it with such a profound sense of interdependence is really missing from the way that libertarianism shows up today. Most people who consider themselves libertarians consider the market as this primary rule. So instead of looking to the state as a force of domination, they look at it in a, I don't want to put too much of my own bias on it, but it's this hypocritical sense of seeing the market as what's dominating them, except the market is made up of autonomous individuals. However, a lot of the time, because they leave everything up to the market, that sense of interdependence and actually caring for each other and really seeing the way that one's autonomous decisions affect an entire network of people, and in a globalized society, the whole world, especially when you have the kind of corporate power that market dominators have, it's not really taking into account that strong ecological and social interdependence. So,
in fact, they're rugged individuals.
Yeah, exactly. So it's putting that individual preference over that of the community a lot of the time. There's, in fact, just a lack of even communal ontology,
So
yeah,
I have a question about that.
What was that?
I have a question, and I'm wondering if maybe we could come up with a better word than libertarian. Because to me, that using that language as his definition then requires like
a lot of translating.
Yeah, exactly. And then once again, you're kind of in a position of like making another concept or whatever wrong.
Yeah. So the way that he uses social ecology seems appropriate. I think since he is trying to distinguish himself from anarchism, maybe just a mutualism,
or even social ecologist, or
yeah, exactly,
instead of the libertarian.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I think that pretty much covers it in terms of that difference.
Right.
And then the other two things, so I'll do the third thing first, which is the way that I feel a little bit, I don't really appreciate the way that he views identity and self-expression through protest, in the sense of that, like, we're reacting to what we dislike in society and that's how we define ourselves, rather than focusing on, I define myself by my values and the way I practice those values in my engagement with others. And the way that he idolizes direct action as forms of protest.
I see the permaculture communities that I'm familiar with as taking positive direct action.
Yeah.
To the degree of isolating themselves from the politics and not even wanting to hear about it. It's just, we're here on our land. We want to do what we do with this land to make it better and for everyone. And that's our action in the world.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I totally agree with Ken. I think that change is not going to come through the electoral system. Change in society is going to come through groups that take initiatives, like the permaculture and others that at one point, like Lynn Margulis will anticipate, will unite, and coming from different backgrounds. For example, I was never a religious person. My parents were not religious. I never practiced any religious in life. But recently, as I have become older and older, I developed an interest in spirituality. And I decided to start a spiritual life. And I joined the center that we have here in my area called the Center for Spiritual Life. And it's not a dogma, it's not a religion, but it's a group of people. And you will be surprised how many things that we say at the Center for Spiritual Living are part of this book. I mean, the essence, the fact that we are all linked, that we have to, the things that we are unity with nature, the unity between all forms of life, the unity and you know, groups like these, maybe permaculturists will join the groups of people that work on food system, alternative food systems, and will join people that promote a spiritual living, and will join the people that promote the permaculture, and will all generate, crystallize some kind of change in the future. I don't know when it will happen, but it's not going to come through our electoral democracy that only produces monsters, in my view.
Yeah, I agree. I also saw an example of something kind of unusual that I thought I'd share with you in regard to the direct action question, because I also have a hesitation to want to focus my attention around a protest particularly. I did that for a certain period of my life. And I had a friend when I was working in the freeze movement who said to me, blah, 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 you blah, 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 God. And I said, oh, I don't believe in God. And he said, yes, you do. And I said, no, I don't. And he said, yes, you do. Your God is the nuclear bomb. You have organized your whole life around that. And I had to stop what I was doing because he was right. So that inner awareness required me to completely reorganize myself. I wanted to be focused on something that was proactive, not against. And when we went to the that big march, the Women's March in San Francisco, it was very exciting. I don't know how many of you did this. I think, Mom, you went to one. There were people from all different walks of life, groups and interests, who came together around these issues. But yet there was a question of like, well, what do we do beyond the protest? We're just speaking our mind. And I think Bookchin talks about assemblies as being part of how he's defining direct action. And this to me is where there's a promise of something deeper, that when the different affinity groups get together in assemblies, that I think he's defining that as direct action. What do you think? Did anybody catch that?
I agree. Yeah, I think so. And I think that the piece about permaculture that Kanemaru brought up too, because you know, he's talks about self-management, you know, and yeah, in relation to these protests, but I think that there's no greater self-management than getting your basic needs met. And permaculture guilds and things like that are able to do that, and assemblies that come together around local issues are a way to do that.
So I want to just show you all something real quick. This was an event that that's being promoted in Santa Rosa as a May Day event, and Worker Struggle Has No Borders. And I just want you to see the details. It says mobilization to protest banks that invest in private detention camps, free and reunite children with their parents, $15 minimum wage, climate justice, public banks, end homelessness, provide housing for all, and police accountability. These are a lot of different issues. And this to me was like, oh my God, here is a natural evolution that's happening where March, a direct action, is now not just on one issue. It's almost like there's an assembly wanting to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never seen anything like that before. They've always been single issue, you know, kinds of things.
I just finished reading this book, which has taken me several months, which is an amazing book. Nomi Prince was principal at Goldman Sachs, and she wrote about how after the financial crisis of 2008, the central bankers, starting with the Fed, but around the world, conspired to do something called quantitative easing, which is create or conjure money and give that to the big banks, with the idea, it's basically a follow-up of trickle-down economics, that the big banks would loan them to the big corporations, and then to the little corporations, and then basically the real economies would benefit. Instead, the big banks used it to increase their profits and pay themselves enormous bonuses. And so this created a greater and greater disparity in wealth, which has led towards these movements towards reactionary right-wing movements around the world. But it's basic. So
what's the book? I'm sorry, I can't see it because of my screen. Collusion?
By Nomi Prince.
P-R-I-N. I can't see the end.
P-R-I-N-S.
S. Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And she is just brilliant and amazing, and it's got thousands and thousands of footnotes, and it's dense reading. But if you just read the summary, it's what I just said, kind of, except expressed a lot more articulately. And that your movement that you just were talking about in Santa Rosa, Maxine, that they're talking about the relation of banks to these corporate prisons and kids at the border. I mean, that's so important, that these people have been totally in the shadows. The central bankers, they don't get much press except in the financial news. No, but and now, at least in Santa Rosa, they're getting at least some of the connection with some of the hierarchical stuff, because this is about the top of the hierarchy, the central bankers.
Yeah. So one other piece in regard to that is that I mentioned that book, The Psychology, Embracing Life Towards the Psychology of Interdependence, last week.
Mhm.
And I feel like it's a great companion to The Ecology of Freedom. I feel like he's taken a lot of the same source material, but not from the political and historical, but more from science and psychology. And it adds another component. And what he says in there, which I hear Bookchin getting at, is that we have this dichotomy in our thinking often, that nature's doing something and humanity's doing something. And humanity's either doing it in accordance with nature or over nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes that humanity bad, nature good, or nature bad, humanity good, okay? Well, in psychology, in Embracing Life, he talks about the fact that there is actually an evolutionary thrust of which nature and humanity are players, co-players.
Yeah.
Co-create.
That sounds wonderful.
There's like a consciousness, a super consciousness that is actually driving life and driving continued life, fecundity, as Bookchin talks about it, right? Mm-hmm. Sustainability, as many environmentalists will talk about it these days.
I like the word fecundity. The way he uses it, it's really wonderful.
So in that regard, there's something going on, and mm-hmm. we may be tapping into this thrust, as he suggests, like that we can be part of how we become competent policymakers is to develop some discernment around what's motivating my action. Am I trying to support life, mm-hmm. or am I impeding it? So this is a great question. It seems to me to take forward from here is to keep looking at, is what I'm doing, does that impede life or does it support it in some way? And
beautiful kind of like a personal growth tool to put out as a way to think about your action moment to moment, day to day.
But it's not just personal. It's because what's so important is that my actions, everything I'm doing is affecting everything around me and everyone. Yeah. So Sophia, the 3 principles of social ecology, do you want to name them?
Yeah, so on page 436, the first one that he really outlines is that it's not so much 3 principles, I guess, as much as like 3 assumptions or premises, he says. But one of them is accepting the radical notion of the individual's competence to be a self-governing citizen, which we've talked about a good bit. The second one is on page 437 towards the top, and that there's a clear that in creating libertarian institutions, there should be a clear distinction between the formulation of policy and its administrative implementation. Mm-hmm. And so that's like, the administrator shouldn't be the one that's deciding the policies. The people who the policies affect mm-hmm. should have a place in that decision-making process. And that's where he gives the critique of the councils. And then the third one is on the following page, which is that direct democracy is ultimately the most advanced form of direct action. And so being able to take place in the decision-making process is the most advanced form of acting directly, changing the systems themselves. Mm-hmm. And so, just maybe in terms of time, I could do just like a real quick, this is my critique of universal basic income, and then maybe we could have a discussion on what direct action and direct democracy looks like in large-scale decisions. Does that sound good?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool. So with universal basic income, I'm not like completely disparaging. I think that we've made huge strides forward in bringing that out in conversation, insofar as that we're not just accepting inequality as a personal problem. You know, that's the huge issue with extreme individualism for libertarians, is that the blame for hardship is placed on the individual and not on the system itself, and thus the responsibility to get oneself out of hardship is solely on the individual, like pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and not on whole systems change or shifting the inequities of power that lead to hardship. So, you know, when it comes to universal basic income and trying to redistribute the wealth that comes from the huge disparity in terms of who owns the land and the businesses, we're not changing the actual system. We're just giving an enormous amount of power to those that actually make so much profit that it would need to be redistributed. So, because, you know, then we're all dependent on these profit motives of these huge corporations. And so an alternative to universal basic income that gets at this need for redistribution is universal basic assets. And so instead of just having a monthly stipend that comes in, universal basic assets like land, like machines, like investment capital, those things help us get our basic needs met in a way that enables self-determination, and not a dependence on Facebook to redistribute their profits that they get from extracting us anyway, or exploiting us and extracting value from the content that we create in our exchanges with each other on this platform. And so, instead of being dependent on them to redistribute their profits that they get from exploiting us so that we can pay our rent to a landlord that owns our house, you know, so it's by instead redistributing the assets like the house itself and the platforms that we use to communicate, and having more cooperative ownership, having more sense of commons and stewarding the commons that enables us to get our basic needs met, we're able to have that kind of autonomy and self-determination instead of dependence on our corporate overlords. So, and then because of those assets, you know, being responsible for managing those assets and our own self-management for our basic needs, it makes us more competent to take place in these, to take a role in these decisions that we're all trying to make together. So that's my critique of universal basic income, and it maybe I'll take a pause to see if anyone has any questions before I go into it.
I'm wondering if you have a resource on universal basic assets.
Yeah, there's a writer, Marina Gorbis, who I think she works at the Institute for the Future. It's a think tank, and she's written a good bit on universal basic assets as an alternative.
Can you spell her last name?
Marina Gorbis, Gorbis. That's what it is.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have about 15 minutes left.
Okay. So if it's okay with y'all, I would really love to talk about what direct action and direct democracy look like in things like addressing climate change or addressing those interrelated issues in the event that Maxime just showed. Some of those were protest-like, but some of them are also things
I think the children's movement is an example of that.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so what does it look like when you have to make a decision on something like how we're going to address completely shifting our energy systems in face of climate change? You know, how do you have this many people weigh in on that kind of decision?
So
Can I bare my soul about this a little bit publicly? Okay, so I planted several 100,000 trees when I was a young person. So I think that is, you know, now they're 40 years old, and I think, oh, I've done something to help with carbon balance in the world. But now I travel a lot by air, and I feel guilty about that because I have people who in my life who are examples to me of living more environmentally ethically, who travel by rail and take more time if they're traveling at all. And in town, I travel by car, and these friends travel by bicycle more often. And I feel like, oh, my own conscience is weighing on me to eventually change to travel less by air, travel more by rail for long distance, and travel more by bicycle if locally. Is that a good example of direct action, Sophia?
I think that that's a really great example of direct action. I think the question that I have that is still always an open question for me is, how do you synthesize opposing views into one decision? And so, like, I think discussion over, I don't want to say policies because we attach that to the state, but policies could just be agreements among a group. You know, you could, smallest scale, maybe you're in a car sharing program, and maybe the community that Mario lives in has a certain set of cars, and all of those people have to make a decision about a car, and a car breaks down. So they own 6 cars, and one of them is repaired, and they're not sure whether to spend the small amount of savings that they have on repairing that car or purchasing a new one. And people could have totally different views about that. And so how do we go about making a decision that affects everyone in a way that is non-coercive?
So, I mean, doesn't it start in local communities, like neighborhood community boards, town councils? I'm thinking about those smaller assemblies, like starting local and creating a cohesive group that starts to learn how to do exactly that before it connects with bigger. I think it always starts local. What you were talking about, Ken, is those are personal choices. So that's right? Like, that's a tension that each one of us wrestles with. I saw somebody the other day who has a motorized bike. Mm-hmm. So it's like a hybrid between the car. She can charge it at home to help her go further on her bike. Mm-hmm. And then use less gas. So it's like, this is a way that she's aligning her personal, what she wants, but also being able to interact in the economy, which keeps her having to get somewhere in a particular period of time. Mm-hmm. So personal, then small local groups, and then larger. And I think that's the idea of confederalism. I'm very, very interested in community groups and how we can create more of those within this economy that has the great majority of people like rats spinning on a wheel they can't get off of. They do not have any spare time for their minds to read, to gather and discuss, to do more than the very basics. That, to me, is about the biggest question I have at this moment.
Can I give an example from a local group? I live in a condo, and there's about 60 or 70 units, and we just had our annual meeting, and we've had this big issue about smokers and secondhand smoke. The thing that I like the least about living here is when I open my patio doors, the smoke from the neighbors has come in, and I think just having had this discussion, because people were bringing up secondhand smoke, that our property values are lower because the smokers are here, that the fire insurance is higher because smoking is allowed. Just having the discussion has made the smokers retreat indoors. So I've been opening my patio doors and I haven't had any secondhand smoke. So that's the positive thing. Just having had the discussion might have improved the situation some.
Yeah, so. I wanna like exclamation point that. Another lesson from my Waldorf parenting experience is that there was once a situation with my child, and I don't remember whether it was with the teacher or what the situation was, or with other kids, but we were talking with the teacher, having a conference, and I was sort of very anxious to have it resolved right away. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, how she ended the meeting was, she said, you know, we've put some good attention to this. Why don't we just let it unfold now? Because it's in motion.
Mm.
And in fact, nothing ever needed to be discussed ever again. It was like just having the dialogue, airing it, like what you're saying, Ken, made a difference. So once again, I'm just going to say, Murray Bookchin said the first
I like
thing.
your choice of words, airing it.
Yeah, airing it out. He said he wants to bring the dialogue into the public sphere, into the, like, to make it an event. So, town hall meeting?
Yeah.
Well, sorry, I want to let Mario speak, but I'm wondering how, my experience in town hall meetings is that there's a lot of disagreement, a lot of inability to come to the same decision in just the smallest of circumstances. But Mario, go ahead.
No, he mentions here that the elites whose own freedom and free time to administer, think, write, create is made possible by exploiting the many. That's something he says. Well, we know that. Very few people have the freedom to have free time to think and write. But we are creating it because we're doing this, and this is this is a creative way of thinking and creating something new.
Yes, and I want to just
Can I add
address
something?
the town hall thing for just a moment. Some things that I've seen have been around candidates, that are running for office. And it seems very bullshit to me, and very like this is for just to make an image of something that we're listening. But and then I've been to other city hall meetings that, it was hard to make decisions. And then it was this elite group that was elected that made the decisions based on what people were saying, but not really. But what I'm thinking about is literally the old-fashioned town hall meeting, which I think they do in Vermont, where the only agenda is to talk about issues that matter to the people who are there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're not going to make a decision. We're just going to talk about it and create a venue and put all the information up there. It's amazing what can happen when people just listen and share and get to be heard and reflected. Now we start to have a place that's safe to bring what matters forward and to hear where other people are at. So I think starting with the dialogue rather than let's fix this problem right now.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that might be a way to approach it.
Mm-hmm.
Mom, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I've been listening to all of you, and I can't help sort of thinking.
We cannot hear you.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I can't help thinking, but that the answers are sort of all of the above. The action to change situation, policies that are dreadful, whether it's the ecology or any of the issues that we know are not going in the direction that we would like them to go in, that would be good for society and our world, is that all of it. I mean, I think, for example, of with the climate change issue, there are organizations, people, starting with scientists and ordinary people who many, many years ago saw terrible things that were happening and created organizations like the Sierra Club or the DC that have been working and continue to work. So they do politicking. They raise funds to do all sorts of things, all the way up to legal. And much is accomplished that way. The same thing with government. Oh, some people expressed despair with government. You referred to the politicians as terrible people, monsters. Some of them are. There's no question. But I watch a lot of them consulted, for their opinions and information on the news, the good, what I call, productive news shows, good, not real news shows. And I think how wonderful they are. I hear Jerry Nadler talk, and I think, he's fantastic. He's going to succeed because what he's saying is true, and there are breakthroughs. And they bring in someone who was a former attorney general, who's totally lucid, who's been through doing things with the Nixon investigation and bringing all that information. And they're working in ways I can't do that, but I can be aware as possible of what they're doing and support them. So basically that's my theory. I know we're getting to the end. But
yeah, no, I think that's
local actions. I'm not, as with you, I served on a community board for 18 years. And so I certainly know the frustrations of dealing. It was in a business district. And so, business interests of New York City's power people in Times Square were dominant on that. But I and others would mention, would express a view sometimes that sometimes had an impact. You do the very best you can. And, so that's exactly what I want to say.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and there are definitely some good politicians, but that they're also, doing the best they can in the current systems that we have, and they serve as representatives. And Bookchin's whole argument is that direct democracy doesn't require representatives. It requires the kind of thing that Maxine was talking about, is direct dialogue. And I would just add that not only does it require direct dialogue, but it requires this kind of inner work that we're constantly bringing up of looking at our own internal imposed hierarchies, and our own work on our kind of individuality and what role we bring in this mutualistic interdependent web of people. And it also requires a sense of trust among the people that are in dialogue, and having built not just trust, but a knowing of where they're coming from, what experiences that they've had that have led them to those perspectives, and trusting them in their competence of being able to express those perspectives. So there's just like a lot of work to be done in order to have a society like that. I totally agree that it needs to be done on the local level, and we need to bring our self-management, self-determination, and getting our basic needs met back to that local level.
And I would just say I've been on a couple of very small committees that were trying to get something done together, and I've had the experience repeatedly where people were so antsy to get to the result and manifest what the goal was, and did not have the perseverance to do the dialogue and to really engage in that inner group work together to say, like, really get under it and do it. I think our acculturation, our conditioning is so superficial that we're suffering a bit from that as a symptom or a disease. And we're going to have to figure out how to coax more and more people out of that need for instant gratification that goes along with the material economy that we're in.
Go ahead. I just had a question. Go ahead.
Oh, and there's one other piece that has to do with this thrust, and that is that he mentions in there, and I think it's well for us to to highlight this and remember that many times when we read something that opens our eyes or that we go, uh-huh, it's actually something we've thought about before. We've had the consciousness, and what's happening is it's being reawakened by the writer or the speaker or the friend. And so the more that we give attention to these pieces that are energizing us and that are enlivening and lightening us, the more we feed that, the more it grows. And we can do that with one another too. And by keeping the dialogue happening to whatever degree the reader, the listener, the other is available to it. And we all are available for new ideas or consciousness at different times, right? So we're 2 minutes over. I'm open to any way to close this that anybody feels inclined. I, for one, just want to thank you and honor each and every one of you for your diligence in tackling this very heady, deep subject matter, and bringing yourselves to it the best way that you did. And I honor each and every one of you. I'm so very grateful and enriched by this process with you.
Thanks to you.
Yes, I'm very grateful also. It's been a challenge for me, but it's been a wonderful opportunity to learn from all of you, and each one of you are
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
extraordinary people with extraordinary ideas and capacity to.
And from you too, Lenore. And from you
Absolutely.
I would like to I would like to stay in touch with you. So I don't know, Maxime, if you could send my address to everybody. I would welcome any of you who don't live around here, if you're in Eugene, to contact me and we could connect and have a cup of tea or coffee or something. And in the last year, I just realized I've been in New York City and I've also been in Sebastopol. I don't know where you live, Sophia, but if I were there, I would, again, I would love to invite you for more conversation and, sharing a cup of coffee or tea or something.
I would love it. And I hope each one of you feel that way, but also, since you've raised it, Ken, absolutely. Come to New York, each one of you. And
I come to New York about 2 times a year because my parents live on Long Island. So, yeah.
And as Maxie knows, it's a big place I have here, and I welcome. It's a fun place, interesting place too. But I'd love to see you all.
So do I have everybody's permission to share your contacts with the rest of the group?
Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
of course.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
Can we take another minute, 2 minutes for me to just throw out a question that's driving me crazy today?
I'm okay with that, yeah.
To see if
I
you
am.
have any ideas of how, excuse me.
While she's away, I just want to say that my friend Phil Beal's sister, Janet Beal, is mentioned in a footnote on page 440, who was Murray's last wife. So I just wanted to put out the personal connection.
Wow.
There, indirect by one. So her book, Finding Our Way, Rethinking Ecofeminist Politics. So he quotes his own wife there in his book.
Nice.
I'll have to look it up. Her name is there?
Janet Beal on page 440 in the footnote on bottom of page 440.
No. Okay, here's my question. Today, Gail Collins in the New York Times, who some of you may know, has written a piece about that's based on, she's a funny lady, a satirical lady on top of everything in her political thing. And roughly it's on the abortion issue. and how so many states have now created so many restrictive policies. And I thought I knew, but I had no idea how terrible it is. Practically, she is saying on the verge of saying that you won't be able to have an abortion after 5 weeks. And she says that's assuming that women are that conscious of what's going on in their bodies that they know whether they're pregnant within 5 weeks. And it's so appalling to me. And since it's so much throughout the states, and she said they're pushing, each one of these states is developing policies knowing that Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court.
They just passed it in Georgia.
Pardon?
They just passed it in Georgia, where I am right now. It's really tragic.
I mean, in terms of this struggle through philosophy and, to understand how to deal with things, is there anything any of you can think of that is a way to overcome this, I guess, what you'd call hierarchy of people using the tenets of the Catholic Church to solve, and trying to get reelected among their constituents to do?
Oh, what happened?
That's my question. Has anybody got any thoughts?
So are you essentially asking, like, what do we do about this, given this thing that we just read?
Yeah, outside of giving money to Planned Parenthood or, local how do you just, I guess you have to just write to, but our Congress people, mine certainly support the way I think. It's those in the other states that are.
Can I take a stab at answering?
Assuming you feel the same way, I don't know.
Yeah, so what I would say is that there's 2 different needs right now. Well, 3, but one of them is to think up and design and experiment with emancipatory forms of organizing society. And the other is to do damage control on the current system we have. And then a third would kind of be like helping that transition, right? Transitioning from the horribly invasive and coercive system that creates those anti-abortion bans. And then also transitioning to an emancipatory system where we have autonomy over our own bodies. And in a way, although they're interrelated, those tactics are very different. And so the tactics that we need to experiment with emancipatory forms of organizing ourselves are different than the tactics of damage control of not passing anti-abortion bills in our states. Because this world doesn't have a state that passes laws over what we can do with our own bodies. But we live in a system where that's the case. And in order to address that, we have to work in some ways within that system while also doing the work of creating emancipatory systems. So I would just answer that this book that we read is dealing much more with this kind of work of creating and envisioning those systems than this kind of work of dealing with what we have now and taking action to ensure that we have as much freedom as we can within this system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Well said. Well said.
Thank you.
When I first moved to California, to the San Francisco Bay Area in '87, I was involved in a group. I was invited to a group of women. It was organized by a nurse who was seeing the potential for losing Roe v. Wade at the time. And what she was doing was she assembled a group of women and started in a model very much like the consciousness raising groups of the 1960s, made a very safe container and helped the women get to know their own bodies internally and support each other to get very familiar with the internal physiology. And she had a goal, and her goal was to identify a group of women who wanted to learn how to do abortions safely, to create an underground railroad. So that's another, like there's so many different levels. And I love, Sophia, how you articulated the different ways that we can go about this with any given topic. I, for one, have to be engaged in coming up with emancipatory organizations and institutions. That's where I'm resonating myself, but it's not that we couldn't do several at one time.
Divide our efforts and support those. Like I have some friends that are in the Georgia state legislation, and they are spearheading. They spend every day working on those efforts and have unfortunately failed in this particular case. But when they ask me to call someone and give me a script for what to say, I'll do it. But I focus all of my efforts on forming like these emancipatory structures,
Yeah. So I think we all get to use our own value system and our own capacity and comfort level and passion to decide where we want to put our energy.
And certainly donating to Planned Parenthood is important, Laura.
Yeah.
Yes.
And calling your congressman whether or not they listen. So to close out.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful summation from each of you.
Yeah. Can I make a suggestion on a closing thing? So given the way that this book ended in terms of the vision that it was holding, I'm trying to find what, I won't look for the page, but my point is that I would just encourage us all moving forward to really hold that vision in ourselves and look in the communities that immediately surround us for ways that we can interact with others that bring out those values, that value of usufruct, having the usefulness of things be more important than private property, values like interdependence and mutuality, really see how our actions affect others and how to create relationships of mutuality in our direct surroundings. That's just what I would say. It's as a way to pull out, is let's explore how we can pull these principles into our lives and create these systems within our own communities. And maybe we can have a gathering in a month or 2 or 3 or 6 and just talk about how these principles have affected us in the way that we engage with others.
Yes, and what we find out there. I love it.
Cool.
Nice idea.
All right.
Cool.
Thanks.
Lovely.
Well, this has been wonderful. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Yeah.